Welcome, everybody. In today's interview with Lea Pica, we are going to discuss tips for making effective data presentations. So, this is a good time to tag a friend or share this with your colleagues so that they can listen to this as well. For those of you who are new, my name is Hannah. I'm the host of the Art of Communicating Data show, which is what you're listening to right now. I go live to record these interviews for my podcast. So, if you join live, you get to ask your questions and get the help you need with your data communication journey. Now I want to welcome Lea Pica. She's a data storytelling, presentation, communication, and emotional intelligence speaker and trainer. She's also the author of a Present Beyond Measure, a book. I actually remember a few years ago, my friend Hiba telling me about your podcast with the same name, the Present Beyond Measure show. So it's nice to have you on my show. And yeah, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Hannah. And it's lovely to be here. I'm excited to be streaming this live right now. It's not like the normal thing. So this is going to be great. We're going to be on our toes. And I just really appreciate having the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for coming on here. And before we dive into the specifics of data presentations and storytelling, I love to start with a broader perspective for our listeners because I know in crafting an effective data presentation takes a lot of effort, time, and deliberation. And I know some folks may wonder if it's worth all that effort. So I was wondering if you can. From sharing from your experience, how effective have you found data presentations being in transforming businesses or careers? And specifically, if you can think of any examples you've seen personally or with training others of how a well-crafted data presentation can lead to significant impact for the person as well as the business.
Yeah. So I have two specific instances. One is my own, where when I sort of fell into a rabbit hole of suddenly discovering, like it was like a big aha moment over 10 years ago now, 12 maybe, that the way that I was presenting data and information, especially during business meetings to decision makers and stakeholders, was the reason why I wasn't inspiring the action and change and movement organizationally that I wanted. When I started implementing the tools that I teach now as a workshop facilitator, when I started implementing that, I actually started seeing those results. So, one particular example was when I noticed a lot of abandonment happening on the site search results page. So, people on our website would conduct a site search looking for something and then abandoned after the first results, which screams a volume about the experience that they had with those results, right?
Right.
So this was really important. And I did not want this to fall into what I call the data black hole, which is where I know a lot of practitioners like me felt like their insights would go because people just wouldn't get it or they wouldn't understand or they wouldn't care. That's the worst part, that they wouldn't care.
Mm.
And when I actually crafted a presentation that sold home, that showed the stakes of what this is happening, the amount of people that this was happening to, and what that meant for our customer relationships. But I did it in a visually compelling, storified way. The results spoke for themselves. People were galvanized into action, and we created like a cross-functional task force to solve this issue. And we actually reduced site search abandonment by 30% within the first few months of
Wow.
implementing major changes. That's kind of like the textbook, like you find an issue or a conflict in the story, you present it right, and you actually get people to take action. And it is that case study that launched my career as someone who teaches this for a living. And a lot of why I was able to create a professional speaking career was because I use all of the principles that I teach in how I teach. So, all of the principles, the techniques, the storytelling, all of that I teach, I use in my teaching. So it's how I walk my talk, but I'm actually showing what happens, that you can be a data analyst that is kind of spinning their wheels and being what Avinash Kashyap calls like a data squirrel and just churning out reports. And you can suddenly learn how to do this and you can become a in-demand professional speaker on the conference circuit who becomes a published author. Like, you can actually do this. And the second example that I have is when I was beginning my speaking career, there was a person in the analytics field who had come to one of my events, and she came up to me and said, I felt like something has been going wrong and I'm actually considering leaving this field permanently and just trying a completely different field. Like, I'm ready to give up, but I
Wow.
feel like inspired to try, like maybe this is the missing piece. She went on to like exceed me in terms of her industry involvement, her passion. She became a board member of the Digital Analytics Association. She's now on one of the top analytics podcasts and working with some of the absolute best people in the business that, I consider my friends. So she turned almost bailing on this as an entire career to being a revered subject matter expert. And it's because she jumped on the bandwagon of learning effective visualization. And is that a typical story? No, but it shows what's possible for you when you even implement 10% of what you can learn about this in terms of making a difference.
Uh, Thank you so much for sharing these stories and these examples. I think a lot of us can see a little bit of ourselves in these examples, particularly when those of us who have been presenting or trying to communicate the importance and the impact of our work and not seeing that land with our audience. As you mentioned, going to that data black hole and never seeing any movement or action from our audience based on what we've communicated and the work we've done. It can be disheartening to see, all this work we do and it's so important to us, but not see any action taken from that. So it's really inspiring to hear that how we can be a little bit more deliberate and intentional with our crafting our data presentation and our stories and our visualizations so that we can see that. In your book specifically, you mentioned these two pillars of successful data presentations: simplicity and intentionality. Can you elaborate more on why these are so crucial for presenters and how they can achieve them?
Absolutely. And I want to say I'm always so grateful when people take the time to read and pull things out of the book. So thank you for that. Um, These are the two pillars for me because information communication is a very broad discipline. It tackles and requires knowledge and skills of a lot of different areas. So there's a lot to learn. So I tried to boil it down to be simple, which is, the first one. So the biggest complaint that my decision makers and all the clients' decision makers of the people, the leaders that come to me for workshop training is they're overwhelming the audience. They're overwhelming the
Mm.
decision makers. They go into the data and they just dump a whole bunch of stuff and they drop it all in there. And the clients have asked them to not show more than 10 slides so that they, so that they can understand. And things like a limit on the number of slides you're allowed to create, that is a symptom of a deeper root illness,
Mm.
for lack of a better word, or, deeper root cause, which is we don't know how to filter down to a subset of information that is relevant to each other and actionable for the audience. And one reason is because we don't have a really strong dialogue or common language that we speak as practitioners with our decision makers.
Mm.
Decision makers will say, just give me all the data. What do you got? And that's exactly what the practitioner will do. And they'll put everything they have on 50 different slides that are packed to the gills with charts and tables and graphs and bullet points and, call outs, all kinds of things. And then they'll present those busy slides all at once in one view, and they don't understand the neuroscience that their audience's eyes are like bouncing around
Mm.
that slide like a pinball, and they're not listening to what you're saying at all. They're visually trying to take it all in and figure out, what does this mean to me? What is this actually trying to say? So, unfortunately, in trying to meet what we think, what we hear the clients ask for, because they don't necessarily know how to articulate what it is they want,
Mm.
we just give everything and packaged in a way that is completely counterproductive to helping facilitate insight. So, simplicity is giving absolutely nothing more or nothing less than your audience requires to understand the same insight or observation that you're trying to make. That's the North Star. Okay, so I want my audience to understand that our site search function, something isn't working. I see this because of the high abandonment that's happening. Okay, I'm not going to present. I'm not going to show our conversion rate and our form completion rate and like all these other things that are not supporting this key
Mm.
insight that I want to share in that particular moment. So, simplicity boils it all down. It presents one single idea on a slide. It ensures that the observation we're making about the data is supported by the graph, the one graph or maybe two that is on that slide. And there's not mountains and mountains of other information or decorative objects that are interfering and clouding with that message, right? So that's simplicity. Intentionality is making conscious choices. So, also when we present and we're dumping lots of things in, we are not really designing charts. We're just putting them in Excel or PowerPoint or Tableau or whatever tool we're using, just dropping them in, leaving the default formatting or palette or whatever. And we're just walking away, but we're not actually crafting that chart to specifically support the observation that we're making on that slide. We are not creating a call out that adds additional calculation or context to that chart to deepen and sell better the observation or the thesis statement that we're making on that slide. We're running amok with the color palette. We're letting all kinds of decorative objects get in there. And that's why with my Pica protocol, the first letter of the protocol is P for purpose. Purpose is, what is the reason I'm making this choice? What is the purpose of this? And even though the protocol begins with that, it's actually the question you ask at every step along the decision making path, right from what date range am I going to look at data for to find my story, right through to what color am I turning this bar to highlight it and let it stand out from the other data so that they understand and really zero in on what I want them to see.
Yeah, your answer has sparked a lot of questions in my mind. But before I go to that, you did mention Pika protocol, and I wonder for the listeners if you can tell us a little bit more about this approach and specifically walk us through this method and how it can help transform a data presentation.
Yeah, of course. So the Pika protocol is a four-step data storytelling methodology I created that's actually nested inside of a larger four-phase data presentation approach. But basically, the Pika protocol is meant to be a practical, repeatable, step-by-step methodology you can use from a business question or finding a new piece of data right through to how you visually design and sequence that story on a series of slides that you present during a meeting. So, would you want me to go through the steps or what else
Sure.
can I
Well,
share?
maybe what the ICA stands for, since you mentioned purpose already.
Right, I've left you on a cliffhanger, which is a key
Yeah.
storytelling technique, by the way. um, yeah, sure. So we start with purpose, and purpose includes understanding, like, why am I creating this slide? Why am I including this chart? What am I doing here? So it includes a series of questions that you can ask either yourself or ideally your decision maker that you're presenting to, that gets you through to, like, okay, this is the question I'm trying to answer for them, which leads you to selecting the appropriate data visualization type. In other words, a chart. That's what you start with. So that's purpose. You kind of like get to the start, you understand overall the story you're trying to tell, and you get to a first visualization you want to use to tell the story. Then you move to I for insight, which is a bit of a buzzword that we toss around really willy nilly, like, oh, look at those insights. But actually, I find I wasn't using that word to the best of its definition. And my favorite definition of it is a person, thing, something that facilitates a new, deep, accurate, and intuitive understanding of a person or thing. So
Mm,
something that facilitates that. So that can be a chart or an entire slide that you create. So every slide should facilitate a new, deep, and accurate understanding, an intuitive understanding. Intuitive meaning they don't have to do a lot of work to come to the same conclusion
mm,
that you have,
mm,
right? If you're actually fighting to help them get to the same conclusion you haven't constructed the right supporting visual to help them do that. So that's why intuitive, like when we think of web design or any kind of design, a car, you think of like Tesla and Apple. These are really successful brands because of how intuitive they've made things. They've reduced the learning curve and the effort someone needs to understand how to use it, right? We're not doing that. So this is a form of UX, right? User
mm,
experience for your slides and your presentations. So insight is when you use things like proper annotation, zooming in or zooming out on data as appropriate, benchmarks, segmentation, other forms of adding to the data so that you are really helping your audience come to the same conclusion. Then we get to C, which is context, which is interesting. This is kind of like the detective solve the mystery step. So oftentimes we begin a story and we tend to take the first result that we see at face value, but that might not be the whole story, or that might not be enough for someone to make a really informed decision with. So context is an interesting step where we get to put on our detective hats and go a few layers deeper and ask what else might add to the story? What might
mm,
deepen it? What questions are they going to ask as soon as I show them this? What are their objections going to be? And also, sometimes that's where we find a twist in the story. So maybe we start the story with a piece of information that, here's a metric you care about. Okay, everything's fine. Everything's as expected. Oh, but we looked at this other area because we went a little bit deeper and we found something we didn't expect. And boom, you've now integrated the dynamic of unexpected twist and anticipation and surprise, which is a very impactful way to garner engagement with the audience. And now they're on the edge of their seat. They're like, "What? What is it?" Right? So you don't show all that at once, and then they have to parse through
mm,
everything. You show it to them piece by piece. Context is also about strategically revealing segments of the story, steps
mm,
in the narrative to them piece by piece. So you are drawing them in with the breadcrumbs, into the dark forest of data. So that's why context is a really fun and interesting step. And then finally, we have A for aesthetics. So that's how things look. And this is the most straightforward step because this really is more about implementing best practices and guidelines for how the human brain sees and takes in information and interprets it. So it means when you've selected your charts, are you creating them in a way where, back to insight, you're facilitating an intuitive insight for them, an intuitive understanding, or is the chart confusing them or
Mm.
conflicting with you have no idea how many times I see that they'll build charts and such that totally conflict with the observation that they're making or the insight they want to communicate. And I'm like, this does not equal that. And then also, are you simplifying the chart enough and making intentional choices that are creating charts that are helping people go, boom, yes, I get it, of course, right?
Right. I love how this is synthesized into, this Pika protocol. And I think it's so important for data professionals to have such a protocol in mind because we have that curse of knowledge where we're so familiar with the data. We have been immersing ourselves in this data. And sometimes it can feel for our audience that they are drinking out of a fire hose because we're just throwing everything at them when we are presenting it. Another thing you mentioned in the book, and it's something I hadn't heard about before, as I'm not familiar with Chris Anderson's book on this, but he has this concept of a through line and how
Mm,
you mentioned how powerful it can be for presentations and specifically in getting like this running theme throughout the presentation. It made me think of like a presentation thesis. I don't know if that's
yes.
the same thing. Yeah. So I'm curious if you've seen any data professionals or just professionals in general, use this in any unexpected or creative ways to their presentations.
I don't know that I've seen it as like unexpected, but it's more the through line for me is the when you win is not necessarily unexpected or creative. It's more that it follows like a formula that starts a question and teases the answer just enough to get the audience to want to sit through the whole thing, right? So the formula that I have for the through line, because the TED Talk through lines are very lofty and like really big picture, and they're not at all practical
Mhm.
for for a business context. But I created a formula for the through line where it was like talk about what you're talking about. So state the subject or area you're talking
Mhm.
about. Declare several clues to insights that you found in the story. So tease the story and then tease that you've found a solution to the conflict. So
Mhm.
when you're teasing what happened, you're teasing that there's a conflict because I like to say, no conflict, no story. No conflict, no story. If everything is business as usual, you're not storytelling, you're data telling.
Right.
And that's okay. Sometimes there's nothing to tell. That's totally fine. But if we're telling a story, it generally means that there's something new that they didn't know before, which is that insight. It's that new understanding of something. So we're teasing that there's a conflict of some kind, which is generally a problem that is acting as an obstacle or an opportunity to gain something, but there's an obstacle in the way, which makes it a conflict, right? So you're teasing the conflict, but then you're teasing that there is a solution on the way. And that, like, when you follow that approach, I find that that acts like what I call a movie trailer for your presentation. It baits them with, mystery and interest and intrigue, and they want to know more. And it acts like a compass for you as you are building the presentation. You're always remembering, okay, this through line, this is the thesis statement that this whole presentation has to prove. So everything I put in here has to work to serve this thesis statement, right? So in terms of unexpected or creative, it's more that I want to see it's what I want to expect, which is that they're making an interesting statement that's creating an intriguing question of that's making their audience go, "Oh, oh my gosh, of course we don't wanna know how much we wanna know how much money we're losing and where and how to fix this, of
Mhm.
course." Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I found that this, what you mentioned about baiting and engaging the audience with this kind of like a trailer for your presentation. I found this has become even more important for virtual presentations. I do a lot
Mm,
more now,
mhm.
just because audience members are way more easily distracted in a virtual setting. They're not sitting in a room with you where they could be on their laptops or thinking about something else, but in a remote location, there's like 100 other distractions that they have. And I'm wondering if you have noticing this shift to more virtual presentations, if it's changed the way we should be approaching data storytelling, or if you have any other tips specifically for that kind of presentation.
So, restate which kind of presentation
Virtual
specifically?
presentations?
Virtual,
Yeah.
right. So, yeah, in terms of virtual, what you have to recognize is the environment is very different.
Mm,
And if you think that you're working against people's shortening attention spans in person, you are really working against that in terms of
mm,
virtual. So, that plus all of the different technical distractions that are possible, like you can tell when people are having a side conversation or, the browser tab eye dart, as I call it. So, the first thing is just to recognize that it is a more challenging environment and you're just going to do your best to stay engaged. But with this, you really have to however up your personality feels, you have to up it even more for virtual. You have to make people feel like you're really there. And
mm,
another important strategy I use, especially for workshops where I'm training people all over the world and they're about to go to bed or they just got out of bed, and they're not totally awake. I have a really strong start. So I have
mm,
slides built into my presentations that take care of virtual housekeeping. So I take the reins really strongly right at the beginning. Hello, this is who I am. We are gathered here today because I state the objective really clearly. I come in with really high energy. And then I do virtual housekeeping, asking, okay, we're virtual. Let's name the fact that, we're in a technical environment here and there's distractions. So let's see if we can be present by going on do not disturb and turning off water cooler messaging applications and really focusing and keeping cameras on and using the chat. I want to hear in the chat any questions or reactions that you have, and I build in a lot of checkpoints for asking the audience questions so they're kind of kept on their toes and I can gauge things. So I
mm,
also build in a lot of interaction points during the presentation, so it's not just a run-on lecture where I'm just yammering like in a college like in a university
mm,
classroom where they just go on and on and on for a long time. I'm really working to make it like I'm having a one-to-one conversation with each person and
mhm,
asking each of them to weigh in, and it's really about how you take command of the environment and recognize its limitations, and then you just do your best.
yeah, I like how you don't start the virtual presentation with the housekeeping items, which I see many people do, and it's kind of like it's also a time where people could just not have that interest in that presentation or meeting and start to zone out, start checking on their emails and stuff. But starting off strong with that introduction and
Mhm.
I love that approach. And then, speaking of interaction, for those of you who are listening, feel free to pop in your questions or comments in the chat box. I'll be reading them soon. A question that did come in from a follower
Yeah.
beforehand was about imposter syndrome for data
Mm.
professionals who experience this. What are some unconventional strategies beyond just doing affirmation mantras that you've seen data professionals use to overcome this?
Absolutely. So I'll share the one that was the most useful for me because I had and still encounter imposter syndrome all the time. So, the first thing to recognize is that imposter syndrome is a voice in our psyche that was planted by someone else. And because I teach a lot of emotional intelligence, as you mentioned, I look a lot at our pasts, our childhoods, how we were raised. I look to a lot of that as information for where these voices come
Mm.
from. So sometimes I'll go in and I'm a little zen, I'm not going to lie, but I'll go in and I'll ask myself, who does that voice sound like
Mm.
that I know of? And, excuse me. And sometimes that will give me interesting information and recognizing that that's not actually how I feel or what I believe, but it's something someone else believed and kind of planted. The second strategy that I have is playing a game called And Then What? So, analysts, data people in particular, I think one reason we love data and making data informed decisions is because we're not the most risky. We're a little more risk averse and we can be prone sometimes to anxiety and things like that. So that's why presenting can feel really, nerve inducing. So I'll practice and then what with my workshop students and I'll say, okay, so we're afraid, we're feeling nervous, we're feeling like an imposter. Why? Okay. Because I didn't prepare for this enough and I'm going to forget my
Mm.
material. Okay, great. And then what? Um, they're they're gonna all scratch their heads or they're gonna laugh at me. They're actually gonna laugh at me. Okay, and then what? They're gonna embarrass me in front of my boss and everyone, and then my boss is gonna call me in the office and tell me that I'm fired. Okay, and then what? I'm gonna lose my job, and I'm never gonna find another job because 'cause I'm the laughing stock of the industry, and I'm going to end up homeless and be living in a box with my cat. So, this anxiety that people have about being an imposter
Mm.
leads to living on the street in a box with their cat. So, there's a tremendous amount of imagination that's happening there. And then what gets us to the underlying stories and beliefs and
Mm.
fears, and it helps us get to what is pretty irrational. Even if you lose your job, you'd probably find another one. Like, you
Right.
walk it back and you're like, "Okay, I'd probably find another job. Okay, I'm probably not gonna get fired. I'm probably" like, you walk back that way. But then also it helps you recognize, like, why am I like, why don't I feel like I'm an expert in this field? Why don't I trust my own expertise?
Mhm.
Where am I not feeling confident? And it gives us a GPS to understand where are we lacking confidence in ourselves. That's screaming that imposter name.
Yeah, this is a really helpful. There was another guest speaker I had who talked about, tapping into the subconscious and thinking
Mhm.
about the programs we have in our mind. And this can be such a challenging exercise because it could be a program we run so many times since childhood. You mentioned it could go as far back as that, and getting to that deep rooted, that original program that started this all can be challenging. And then to reprogram all that can also be even more of a challenge, but so important because I think that will reflect in all aspects of our lives.
Yes, which is why I teach this.
So important, yeah. Yeah, and then catastrophic thinking that, we can sometimes get ourselves into. It's so interesting as at the same time funny because yeah, like, it's the scenario is probably not gonna happen. It's probably not
Right.
as big as we make it. Uh, yeah.
Bringing the level of preposterousness to
Mm,
it brings some levity
mm,
that allows us to cut through the intensity of the panic and the belief. And like you said, tracing back, well, I like to say, data people could understand that our supercomputer up here is run on software, and a lot of the software that was installed when we were kids, and it's running on repeat over and over, just saying different things until we become aware. And that's just the first
mhm.
step is just awareness, which is why we begin to look back at that and start to make those connections.
Yeah. And I really encourage listeners to really address and challenge this because I know some people may compensate their imposter syndrome or lack of confidence with blind confidence and just
Right.
including. And I think that can actually be harmful in the kind of presentation we end up delivering because sometimes we end up overcompensating and just throwing a lot of data information just to prove like we know our stuff. We are data professionals. We are experts
Right.
in this. And here are the complicated algorithms that I use that it's just you end up creating a presentation that's more about building your credibility and authority and not so effective way but your audience is just completely lost. It went a lot of stuff went over their head because they're just like, well, so what, and what are we doing here?
Yeah, and that's what I call the pendulum effect.
Mm,
So one part of us kind of grabs the wheel and tells us we're an imposter and we're going to fail and we're doomed. And another part of us is like, "No, I don't wanna believe that." So it yanks the pendulum that way and becomes overconfident to the point of lacking humility
mm,
and the willingness to entertain other perspectives or be challenged or questioned without collapsing under feeling like a failure. So it's all very it's all very interesting and intertwined, but what I would say is try to always walk that line between confident enough, where you feel good and strong going in, but remain humble and open to the idea that mistakes happen, that other people's perspectives are valid, and that it doesn't mean anything about you or your character or your worthiness if you get something wrong.
yeah, I love this. This has been a really insightful conversation, and I know there's loads of other helpful advice and insights in your book that I'll talk about in a little bit. But one thing I wanted to also touch upon, I've been asking my guests this, particularly for their industry, is looking ahead, what kind of trends do you see emerging in this field of data storytelling, data presentation, and how do you advise people to prepare for that?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, if there's one area, it's like the worst kept secret, which is AI. How does AI play a
Mm,
role in all of this? And what I would say is, you know, I wouldn't run to AI necessarily to create your presentations, to design them. There's a lot of limitations when it comes to that. And I don't think AI is ever going to truly substitute for the way that a human can see a story and find insight and create that empathy. But what AI can be instrumental in doing, how I use it, is I use it to create customer or audience avatars for the talks or
mm,
presentations I create. I feed it, the kinds of challenges that they're going to have and what kind of things they're responsible for. And it actually helps fill in more gaps for me to understand what my decision makers want or audiences want. And then I use it to kind of create a framework of how it would fit into a framework I call store or not I call, sorry, a well-known framework called Story Brand, sorry, which was created by Donald Miller. And it's an excellent sort of distilled hero's journey that's really geared for brands
mm.
and marketing. But it's great at selling the story piece by piece. And I kind of couch it in that. And then I work to build the presentation around that using the human skills that I have that AI can't substitute for.
Awesome. You mentioned about marketing a lot. I know you have that background, right, in marketing, digital marketing, was it specifically?
Mhm.
And I see that a lot with your, because there are other sources and books out there that could help people with presentation. But what I like about your perspective is that it's from this marketing approach where you are thinking about the client or stakeholder avatars and how to distill a message where you're actually able to sell your point or your message to them. So it's been interesting to see that come out in your answers and in your books as well. For those who are interested in learning more about Leah's methods, protocols, her advice, I highly recommend you check out her book, Present Beyond Measure. I'll link it in the show notes as well, so you can find that easily. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all this with us, Leah. It's been really helpful. How can folks connect with you, or if they're interested in taking a workshop with you or just getting in touch with you, how can they do so?
Of course. So my website, leapica.com, spelled just like my name here, is the best place to start. Also, going to Amazon and searching for my name or Present Beyond Measure, which is my book. My book is really, my entire process in book form, and it's an excellent way for us to get to know each other at a really cost effective level. But if you're interested in training for a team or event, leapica.com/workshops will get you right to where you need to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on the show. And thank you to the listeners for listening to this episode.